Okay, hi. So 23rd of September. Should I wait a minute? Or people can come in. Are we presenting? This is Anthropology and the Human Condition. Am I right? Am I right? Am I on the right day? In the right place? Lecture number 6. Okay, group 2. Today, I want to talk to you about colonialism. So, it's really not very bright, is it? What will happen if I turn off? Huh? I wrecked it. Okay. Can you see the board from the projector from over there? You might like to move more to the center. You can see this. I mean, you can see it, but it's easier if you're over there. Okay? You're okay there? All right. It's not a problem. Welcome. So, second time. I want to talk about colonialism and the colonial encounter. Will give you an idea of how anthropologists talked about the colonial encounter and domination, colonial domination and resistance, or at least theoretical, methodological ways in which they talked about that. Hi, please. Okay. So the reading was John Gledhill's essay from his book Power and Its Disguises. And I feel quite attached to this essay because in part the essay is a book version of his course in political anthropology at Manchester University, which he took over from me. And he improved it. He did it better, but what's really exciting for me is the reading list that I had made and was teaching, he adopted and added a few things. So I got to influence him, a big-time professor. Okay. A big-time professor who then was kind of encouraged to read Yochi Spivak and Ajas Ahmed and various people that anthropologists don't usually read or didn't at that time. Okay? And what this lecture is about and what it marks is we get now in the history of anthropology that I'm kind of doing, we get to a point, the 1960s, the 1970s, where anthropology started to reflect upon what it's doing, its way of doing work. And previously, well, for 40 years, 50 years, 40 years, it had been dominated by the methodology of Malinowski of doing field work, that 1 year in a village or some tribe somewhere, participating in the life of the other people and writing about them. Okay? And what the, you see, what the reflexive turn in the sentence, ethnography, the reflexive turn in the 60s and 70s meant was that ethnographers, anthropologists who did field work, started to think about what they do. The term ethnography, we've discussed it before, but its meaning, can you remind me? Someone? Can you remind me the meaning of ethnography? Ethnography. Someone else? What's the meaning of ethnography? What does the word mean? Look, there are 40 pieces of chalk here. My class this morning, just one. Okay, I'll make a gap, ethnography, to help you. The meaning? Can you help us? What is the meaning of ethnography? Wouldn't be on the spot if you were on time. Can you break up the word into two parts and tell me what the two parts mean? Ethnos. Ethnos. No? Anyone? You already know the answer? You were in the morning class? Ethnos. Okay, ethnos come from ethnos, ethnic, ethnicity. What is your ethnicity? You are either kin or Jarai or male, or it's your identity. Okay, not everyone really has ethnic identity. My ethnic identity is Aussie, Australian, which kind of doesn't mean anything. But in Vietnam, if you are Jarai or Mao, everyone knows what that ethnic category is. Or Trobrianda, or Haganah, right? So these are key meanings for anthropology. Now, graphy, the meaning of graphy, or to go back to the Greek, graphene. Can't do it with a Greek accent. I'm not that ethnicity. Graphene, meaning someone will have, okay, graph paper. Why is it called graph paper? See this kind of paper you use on your notebooks? I just use line ones. It's graph paper. So what does graph refer to? Yes, yours is also graph paper. This kind of paper. What does it refer to? Graph paper. This style of paper, we call it graph paper. And what do you do on it? Write. So graphene has to do with writing. Writing about ethnicity. That's what anthropologists do. They write about ethnicity. But previously, up until in the anthropology that we've been talking about, up until now in that history, they have been doing field work. Remember, go and have a look for yourself. Spend 1 year in Papua New Guinea or Trobriands or Africa or whatever. But in the 1960s, anthropologists started to think, What is it that anthropologists do? Yes, Malinowski went for 4 years to the Trobriands back and forth, but mostly 4 years, between 1915 and 1918. But then he spent another 4 years, 3.5, with his wife, who doesn't get credited, but writing the book. So turning the field work, the notes that are in 5 languages, the messy scene of field work, turning it into a good story. The story of the Argonauts of the Western Pacific who go on adventure journeys to exchange kula. So what did he do for those first 4 years? He did fieldwork, then he did 4 years of writing. Actually, then we realized when he was in his tent, when he wasn't reading novels and playing with himself, he was also writing. So what in the 60s anthropologists started to say was the anthropological project is about writing. It's about writing culture. And in fact, now, by the 70s, by the 80s, the phrase writing culture with a slash between it became like one word. There were like 3 books called Writing Culture, came out in 1982, 6, maybe 86. But they were the end of 20 years of debate, started largely by Clifford Geertz, although this reflexive anthropology, reflexive turn started earlier, maybe, but 20 years of debate about what it is that anthropologists do, and focused on what they do is writing books, monographs, ethnographies that go into the library, basically, for other people to read and to learn, to teach students, to advise people about the whole world. And so people who had been in training to become anthropologists, but also in sociology or in other administrative disciplines to become economists or colonial officials or in the War Department or something, they would read these books. Anthropology was not about being in the field. It was about that, but it was, even when you were in the field, it was being on the shelf that mattered, being on the bookshelf, producing books. Anthropologists were in the business of making books. And Malinowski was going to quit anthropology if a publisher did not take his book the 40th time. If you remember, I said he'd written to his wife, future wife, Elsie, saying, if Methuen don't take it, we're going to go into the margarine business. He could easily have become just a butter salesman. So, ethnography is key. The field work and writing together, when you think about that, you have to think that anthropology and field work and writing books is a part of an institutional context. The library is an institution, it's a building, it's a place, it's a part of a university, which is a part of a system of disciplines, a system of knowledge that has global significance. Okay. And what it is that anthropologists were doing, they were making knowledge about, they were writing culture. Ethnography, they were writing about people. Or as someone said to me when I was doing my field work on tourists in Calcutta, John, you just stare at people and then write books about them. Yeah, that's what anthropology is. You stare at people, you watch them, and then you write a book about them. Very strange activity. But actually, it starts this reflexive turn, reflex, meaning reflect upon yourself, turn the focus from others to yourself, reflexive turn to think about what it is that anthropology does, and anthropology students should do that too. That was the message. That started a bit earlier than Geertz. It even started as early back as Evans Pritchard, when he wrote about the person that was really crucial for understanding the others, and that was the informant. What do we mean by informant? Okay, in language, informant, the word informant comes really from the, I don't know, does anyone read a lot of detective novels? Or police crime TV or something? Maybe spy novels? Stuff about espionage and the war? MI6, CIA. So what this word informant signifies to me as a reader of detective novels and interested in spies and so on, for my sins, is that's where the word informant comes from, that literature, because the undercover police or the police on the patrol, to understand the crime situation, they need an informant. Someone from the gang or the underworld, or if in spying, someone from the other side, from the enemy, needs to secretly tell them, to inform them. Or that person who lives in the underworld informs on their friends to the enemy. The informant. And anthropology adopted this word to talk about that person who's like a broker of knowledge. The in-between person, the person in between the tribe, say, or village, and the anthropologist who translates to the anthropologist, brokers knowledge. Like someone brokering a deal in a business context. You have someone with money, the capitalist, and you have an investment opportunity in some other country. You need someone from that country to contact and say, this is where you invest. This is the opportunity. I will broker a deal for you. So anthropologists, well, Evans Pritchard wrote an essay about the lying informant. The methodological significance of the lying informant, where he worried about his informants, members of the Noor group. They were not telling him the truth. Of course they weren't. Of course they weren't. Remember, he arrived very arrogant, and he wanted them to carry his luggage all the way over to the shady trees, and they wouldn't do it. He must have been really annoying, and why would they tell him the truth? He has all these questions. It's really irritating. He asks questions all day. I'm just going to say any old thing. This actually became a big controversy for Margaret Mead. Margaret Mead, the American anthropologist who worked on Samoa, in Samoa on young women. She interviewed many young women, and she came up with the theory or the argument. Her ethnography was that young women in Samoa had much more free sex. Here she wrote this, that she was told by the young women that they were having lots of sex with boyfriends and it didn't matter and so on. But these women, it turns out, were probably lying to her. They were probably bragging. They were just telling her stories to, wind her up, to get her, because they knew that's what she wanted. She wanted some risky stories. And so they made up these things. Because later anthropologists asked the parents, of course the parents didn't know anything about that, or maybe the parents were lying as well, who knows? Anyway, a focus on the informant started to get anthropologists to think about who they work with and what they do, and it started the reflexive turn. Then there was a book by Del Hymes. called Reinventing Anthropology, The Reflexive Turn, and especially a book that's important by Talal Asad called Anthropology and the Colonial Encounter. Anthropology and the Colonial Encounter. And it got anthropologists thinking about the context in which they do what they do. Writing books in the context of a colonial encounter between the West and other cultures. Now, Gledhill picks up an idea from Gayatri Spivak that goes, rehearsing the old context story can be another way of denying Europe's others a role in history. Okay, what does this mean? To rehearse a story means to tell that story over and over again. And it turns out that anthropology and history, Western history, keeps on telling the same old story in a way, or kept on telling the same old story in a way over and over again. The history of the world, from a European point of view, was that some intrepid guys from England and Spain and Portugal on the edge of Europe, instead of riding their boats around the Mediterranean, managed to go, well, first of all, across to Africa, the USA, the Americas. This was Columbus. He thought he was going to India, but, you know, things happen. Well, actually, they thought they were going to sail off the end of the world. They thought they were going to chug along in the ocean and then suddenly drop off into, where did they think they were going to go? The drain. But Columbus crossed the ocean in 3 tiny little ships. What a hero. The Santa Maria, the Esmeralda, and anyone know the third ship name? Santa Maria, Esmeralda. I want to say Maria, but anyway, by the by. Anyway, what heroes? This is the rehearsing of the encounter story. The hero leaves Europe and goes and meets Indians. Well, American Indians, Native Americans, rather than the Indians of the... Why was he looking for them? Because another man on another ship from Portugal had sailed all the way around the coast, past Madagascar, past Diego Garcia, up to India, Malaysia, Singapore, New Guinea, Vietnam, Philippines, Japan, and Australia, Tasmania, New Zealand. And you know, Captain Cook and Magellan and William Dampier, all these other great sailor explorers left Europe, crossed the seas. The first one to get to India, who landed in Surat, was Vasco da Gama. Not a hero at all, you know. When he got there, when he met informants that he didn't like, brokers that he didn't like, who apparently one of them tried to take some food or something, he cut their ears and nose off to spite them. And a ship with 1,000 Indian Muslims going to Mecca was sunk. They were going to Mecca to pray to Allah, but he's a Christian. He thought they were heathens and just sunk them and they drowned. Vasco da Gama was no hero, and many of these hero explorers were no hero. Captain Cook got to New Zealand and met native people, shot them, the first ones he met. Your first encounter with Australian Aboriginals also included shooting them in the leg, not dead, but still, awful. But this is the rehearsed story. Europe sailed out and discovered the world. Sorry, do you feel discovered? For starters, Europeans came to this part of the world because there already was a history and an economy. They came to get rich from the pepper trade, from the spices that were there in the community in Indonesia, and pepper and nutmeg and cardamom, cinnamon. Right? They came for spices. They went to Africa to get slaves to take to the plantations that they were building in the Americas. They came with an intent, but to have slaves, to be able to buy slaves, the English bought the slaves from Muslims who captured them from indigenous tribes, or to go to get pepper from the plantations in Indonesia, or later to get cotton, woven cotton, silk, indigo, opium from Bengal, meant that there had to already be a thriving economy in those places. So the colonial encounter story, which tells the story of Europeans going out to discover the world, is by definition erasing, removing the history of others, because they already had, in fact, in this part of the world, India had 1/4 in 1600, 1/4, 25% of global production was located here. Why did Europeans go there and keep on going there? They wanted to get rich. How do you get rich? You steal from the rich and take it home. They didn't come here because these people were underdeveloped. Sure, the Europeans had better boats and better weapons. They had repeating guns, bigger cannon, and more trained armies. And they were able to muscle in on already existing civilization. Okay, it was a hierarchical system, feudal system, Muslim lords, and there's no way I'm saying it was some ideal, fantastic thing. We should all go back to that. The feudal lords, the wind lords, and so on. That was an uneven society, right? The old traditional ways are not to be romanticized. But massive riches were there, and they were taken for 300 years, taken from this part of the world to fuel the Industrial Revolution. You can't have an Industrial Revolution without capital. The Industrial Revolution needed money, free money, to be invested in new production processes, new plant. The Industrial Revolution got that money, A, from the plantations of the slave trade built, and B, from stealing it from India. Okay, so first of all, if we rehearse the contact story, which is the story of great heroic explorers, we miss out, deny Europe's others, so-called others, a role in this history, a founding role, fundamental role that industrial capital, global capital started because the wealth of Asia was robbed. I'm not going to get into how there should be reparations for that and there's debts owed and so on, but you can imagine what that argument might look like. Yeah, so what is the context story usually? It's these heroes came to the Americas, or Vasco da Gama came, the Portuguese came to India, and everything changed. Well, yes, things did change. It became a brutal extraction process. So wealth, instead of being reinvested in the hierarchical system of the feudal lords of Asia, was now extracted. And that over 300 years was, as Marx says, a bleeding process with a vengeance. It was ripped out of Asia. Why does that story not have any traction? Why does it not get attention? Because of that debt. How would it be for Europeans to think that their industrial revolution, of which they were so proud, really was only possible because of the fundamental crime of ripping a whole civilization's wealth from it, systematically? And all these lovely stories we have in literature or in, in literature, but in anthropology too. Think of Emily Bronte or something like that, Jane Eyre, right? Man possessed of a fortune must necessarily be in search of a wife. The first sentence of Jane Eyre, the great novel, right? How did he get that fortune? Mr. Darcy. All of these figures in the romantic literature of the 19th century who are rich, where did they get rich? They got rich from investing in colonialism. They put their money into those ships that went out to extract the pepper trade, the spice trade, the opium trade, indigo, jewelry, all of the riches, cotton, silk, woven materials. And the weird thing was they took the woven, they thrived on the cotton market that was already existing in Asia, and then they chopped the thumbs off the weavers and started their own cotton industry in the north of Manchester and sold cotton goods back to the Indians. I mean, that's why Mahatma Gandhi, built his campaign around not buying British manufacture. Manchester goods was called. Buy khadi, meant buy homegrown, homespun. And his symbol when he was leading the revolutionary movement in India was a spinning wheel, a hand spinning wheel of the peasantry. Anyway, that's getting ahead. Why do the alternative stories have no traction? And I have a second question for you to keep in mind for the whole question is, why did anthropology get reflexive? Why did anthropologists start to think about what they do in the 1950s and 60s? What was it that made them reflexive? And it has to do with the consequences of this history that I'm sketching. An alternative history to the contact story. So it's Gayatri Spivak, my teacher, who keeps on making the point that the arrival of Europeans in those countries that were colonized was not the first act. And that's what I've been saying. The first act was not the arrival of Vasco da Gama. The first act was ongoing and ongoing and ongoing. And in fact, even crossing the ocean, Vasco da Gama was not the first to do it. Jing De, I don't know how to pronounce his name, but Chinese general, actually a eunuch, but anyway, he had sailed like 7 voyages across the oceans of Asia, including going to Africa from China and bringing back, like their boats are not big, right, as well, bringing back from Africa a giraffe. You know, this big animal, the size of a giraffe. How do you get a giraffe on a little boat like that and get it safely across the ocean from Africa to India? He gave it to the Sultan, to the Nawab of Calcutta, of Murshidabad in Bengal. How do you get such an animal there safely unless your sailing skills are very well developed? Right? You don't just pop a creature in the hold and sail off. You need some skills. And they brought not only the giraffe, but they brought the handlers of the giraffe, the Meindi, tribesmen to look after that giraffe, and the giraffe was then gifted to China. Where's China? China's up here. Given by the Nawab of Bengal to the Emperor Yongle. I mean, think about what that means. What kind of society is it in which one king from India gifts such an amazing animal, a giraffe, never before seen, this kind of horse with a huge long neck, gives away, first of all, such a magical beast, and gives it to the Emperor of China, which we think of as two completely separate things. No, across a vast distance. These were not underdeveloped places. They had an international trade. They already had globalization long before. So this is the first act. No, the first act is not contact. The first act of violence, yeah, that was there. That was the first act of contact between Europe and the others was violence, unless you romanticize Marco Polo, but that was later. Sorry? Reflexive. Okay, reflexive means reflect upon. The reflective turn, we had it in the first slide. The reflexive turn, when you turn your vision back on yourself, you reflect upon yourself, you reflex. So Gledhill calls this argument from Spivak post-colonialism, and it's a term linked in with postmodernism and so on. That's a little bit problematic. Post-colonialism does not refer to after colonialism. That's not what it means, right? Post-colonialism is, so the independence movements that, you know, in 1945 meant the independence of Vietnam, 1947 India, 1949 China, 1952 Cuba, 1953, actually, no, 59 is Cuba, 1953 Algeria, and so on. Sure. But 1945, August, there was a Declaration of Independence, okay? And this starts off a series of independent movements that ended colonialism in many countries, India and Pakistan, actually. Okay? And post-colonialism kind of refers to what happened to those independence movements. It's not that after colonialism you get post-colonialism. No, after colonialism, those independence movements that people put so much hope in, we'll get rid of the British and we'll have a real good time, a real equal society. That dream broke down in the face of the global economy within 10, 15, 20 years, and corporations, global corporations, and the colonial powers, in a way, came back. Not as colonizers this time, but as investors. The companies came back in what we call neo-colonialism. They took on investment projects in these different countries, and they did deals with the elite, the leadership that had previously been for independence. They now, like Nehru, socialism, Mao, not Deng Xiaoping, so many others, backed off from the independence dream and dealt with neocolonialism, or, and this is the intent of Spivak and Samir Amin when they use the phrase post-colonialism, they use it in an ironic and restricted sense to refer to the betrayal of the independence spirit by those elites who gave up on the idea of everyone in their independent free countries being equal and reinstated capitalism. Post-colonialism means a kind of colonialism in a new form. So Gledial actually kind of fudges that, and he isn't very good at recognizing Spivak's working through of the double bind. And I'm going to try and explain that. So Gayatri Chakraborty Spivak, she says, can I get someone to read this one? It's mean. How about you? Can you read the first quote, please? Very loud, yeah. For everyone to hear, yeah. Read it out loud. You can if you want, yeah. Oh, come up the front, come on. Sorry, it's hard, right? Okay, good. What work is needed to avoid endless replication of the unilateral Euro-teleological colonial contact story? Good, enough. Thank you. All right, so Spivak Gledhill had difficulty with this. Spivak trying to say, what research do we need to do to displace that contact story? Because that contact story is unilateral. It means it's one side only telling it. Unilateral, right? You have the term unilateral came up into conversation globally when we talked about unilateral disarmament. That meant in a conflict, Vietnam versus America, or nuclear disarmament, US and USA, one side would disarm unilaterally in order to end the conflict, right? And Nixon pretended that he was doing that, pulling out the troops, which was rubbish, but one-sided anyway. Euro-teleological colonial contact story means Euro-teleological, the future of Europe is the story. Teleological means heading towards, movement of history towards its destination. So the story of colonial contact is the story of Europe going out into the world to its destination. And that story completely erases the other people. Everyone else is not a part of the Euro-teleological, the one-sided story of saying Europe made the world as it is today. Well, Europe did make the world as it is today, but it did it through violence, through theft, through plunder. But what work do we need to avoid that story? Because that story is strong. And the history of colonialism was written by the colonial powers. The history of colonialism was written by the colonial powers. So Spivak uses this series of resources and concepts that I have to quickly explain. Subaltern studies is a body of work inspired, first of all, by Ranajit Guha, who's not an anthropologist, but a historian, but nonetheless worth reading, because his book, Elementary Aspects of Peasant Insurgency in Colonial India, is a kind of tribute to Claude Lévi-Strauss's book, Elementary Aspects of Kinship in Aboriginal Australia, right? Elementary aspects. Yeah, that's the only similarity, but no, that's an amazing book. Why? Because Subaltern Studies tries to find the history of the others in the record of the colonials. Right? So the colonial power was the only one with the power to take records, right, and keep them. It collected all this information, this knowledge. And in between, by reading that record, the archive, by reading the archive, you can, if you pay really close attention, see those moments where there was some agency of the others written into the story. So, for example, the British send 4,000 troops to Baroda to quell an uprising. And then they send them to Varanasi or somewhere else. As you're reading this, the story of the great activities by General Baychant or whatever his name was, the British general, you should then say, what happened in Baroda then? Why was there an uprising? Where can we find some information? This is the work you need to do. Where can we find information about that uprising? Sure, 400 soldiers were sent there, but they didn't just uprise out of nothing. They must have built an organization. There must have been some little history about that incident that we can maybe find from some records that weren't collected, or from folk tales, or from family history. We need to really investigate, looking for what the real story was behind the fact that 400 British soldiers went there for a week and quelled an uprising. It wasn't just an uprising. Surely it was something much more. And then you see in the record, he's got one comment. In fact, I really love this one comment. Ranajit Guha says, the English, in a report, one informant for the English said, the people from the villages, they keep on sending chapati, right, some bun, bread, from village to village. We don't know why. Now, it turns out that in that area, sending food, bread, was a signal. This bread being sent from village to village means get ready for the uprising. Gather your weapons, soon we'll be, fighting back against the British. Right? And that didn't get into the record. The British record just says 400 soldiers went there and the villagers were doing something with chapatis. We don't understand it. If you go and try and understand what it was, do interviews, do field work and so on, then you can tell a story from the other side. The history of the resistance to colonialism on the part of the villagers. Of course, their rebellion was defeated, so it's a bit grim. This is subaltern history because, taking the term from Antonio Gramsci, who was an Italian communist theorist of Marxism, who was arrested and locked up by Mussolini for most of his life and wrote in coded notebooks, the prison notebooks, they're amazing things, and was released from prison and died very soon afterwards because the conditions in prison were so terrible. He writes about the subordinate alternative in the army, but talks about how within the army there's a culture of the younger, the lower level soldiers, and they are always in a kind of battle to maintain their ways of doing things against the orders that come on from on high, that they must obey. So they're the subordinate, but they have an alternative story of being in the army. And that idea is the idea of, like, also his idea of hegemony. The dominant ideas, the ideas from up on high, are the main ones, the ones that win, but the ideas from below are battling against them. So the battle for hegemony is a kind of, his word for politics. The politics of how you get your ideas to be the ones that tell the story. So the hegemony at present, in the context of what we're talking about, is the contact story. The arrival story, the colonial context story is hegemonic. It means it's dominant. But what we're looking for is to make the story about others, to do that work, to make that, to challenge the hegemony with that story. Hegemony. From Gramsci. It means something like dominating. Then Spivak gets some ideas on deconstruction from Jacques Derrida. Jacques Derrida, the French theorist from Algeria, that wrote so much about Algeria, but also about philosophy, and had the strategy of deconstructing, finding something in the story that doesn't fit, that shows the contradictions in the story. Finding that and using that to lever open the logic of the story and tell it differently. So she borrows that idea from him. The double bind, which I'll talk about in terms of hegemony and consciousness of revolutionaries. And that's related to aesthetic education. I'm actually going to unfold these a little bit more as we go along. But she argues for the need for constantly to be vigilant, to see that that arrival story, that contact story is continually dominating the way we think. The winners of history write the story. And we are continually tricked into thinking that's true, that that's the only version of the story there is. And we need to do patient work to learn how to unlearn that story. Not saying that elements of that story aren't also true, but there's more to the story than that. But just to illustrate how easy it is for the winners to rewrite history, and not only the winners actually, the losers too. Think of the example of the Vietnam War. Right? You call it the American War, here we call it the American War, and we can tell, go to the War Remnants Museum and you can see it's all about horrible use of phosphorus bombs and Agent Orange and so on. But Hollywood has, which is dominant and hegemonic in the US, has practically convinced Americans that they didn't lose the war. They don't really think they lost the war. They think Rambo, they think Apocalypse Now, they think that the army was held back by the hippies. They couldn't really win. They should have won the war, or they did win the war. In fact, it was all heroic like Rambo, or Full Metal Jacket, or, oh, there's so many of these films. And now the 10-part series 2 years ago by Burns and I still can't remember the other person's name. But it tells the dominant tale, the American version of the war for Americans, right? Is that young people went to Vietnam and it was terrible, it was a horrible, horrible thing. But, you know, if they hadn't been constrained by incompetent generals and public opinion, they could have just won the war. And it takes quite a lot of effort for Burns and whoever he made the film with to actually interview some Vietnamese soldiers who can remember that history and tell it and enter their story into the record. But it's done within, sandwiched within the hegemonic story. But you know that the history of World War II or the history of colonialism was largely written by the British. What would a German history of World War II look like? Right? They didn't win, but what would their history look like? It would be possibly different. For example, they wouldn't be accused of having so many atrocities against the Jews and against communists, and so they would tell the story differently about how Russians attacked and were brutal in their reprisals on German citizens. I know that they would do that because I've seen people try to do that. But usually the winners tell the story. That's the dominant story. And some parts of it will be true. But there's always something else. And what a non-coercive rearrangement of desire will take place is to make that take place is to get us to think about what do we want to do? Do we want to understand the story as given to us by the winners, or understand what to work towards putting down a story about what really happened? Now, the colonial regime that we have to understand for thinking about anthropology in it is one that is a political system, first of all. Europeans came with better armies and better weapons, and they took over the market and dominated. But then they also used knowledge, a system of knowledge, to maintain their control. What did they do? These informants and brokers come to the fore. In order to dominate the colonial sphere, the social sphere, you can't just be a military occupier. People will not do work for you. You need to have brokers, people in between, who will facilitate the opportunities for extraction. And what the British did was they developed, what the British did, maybe is the wrong phrase. What the British made possible, and what Indians, some Indians or some classes took the opportunity to do, is to set up a in-between class, what we call comprador class. Comprador. There's a minute, a policy document by a man called Lord Macaulay that says what we need to do is to create a whole class of Indians who are English in their manners, English in their thinking, capable to read and write and administrate and do our bidding. They will be like Englishmen in India, but they will be brown. So they were not white. They were a class that sat between the rulers, the English colonial rulers, then that class, and the ruled, the rest of Indian population. And they were your brokers. So like you always need a broker. If you want to invest in something, you've got a pot of cash. You need someone to show you where that opportunity was. And to do that, you want to import 4 tons of opium, okay, and take it to China to make money. How are you going to do that? You're going to do it yourself? No, you need to get someone local who knows how to do it for you. Pay them a small part, which is why they will do it for you. You pay them a little bit, and they are the comprador class, kind of servants from the locals. You had them in Vietnam with the French. The French had their favourites, the English certainly. And this also included a massive administrative class. So the British would get the Brahmins, the former religious scribes, they were the literate ones, get them and hire them as accountants and money keepers and records keepers. And they kept massive amounts of records. I mean, this is the census of Britain, of India, and the amount of information. I'm not saying knowledge. The amount of information that Britain gathered about India so it could manage India is still being sifted through. There's still material that's being uncovered and used to really understand. So economic exploitation is supported directly and indirectly by systems of knowledge and classification. You need to divide people up into those who are producing this, that, and the other, those that are helpful in producing it, those that are disruptive. And you also need to know who the opposition to you is. You need information about Mahatma Gandhi and Nehru and so on. You need spies. And you need surveys. And you need anthropological studies. And today, it's ongoing. I want to say, in order to develop India, the post-colonial Indian government, it needs to have many anthropologists doing work on traditional culture and recommending that the Naga highlanders in the northeast of India stick to the book. If they want tourism and the advantages, the opportunities that come with tourism, they should preserve their traditional dances and their traditional dress, not keep on dressing in blue jeans and tight nylon shirts and or Michael Jackson t-shirt, Gap t-shirts or something, right? So even for something like knowledge about tourism, we need a massive amount of information, and it belongs in this colonial system. But that's getting ahead, sorry, but certainly the India survey, the massive survey of India, or think of the French here in Indochina mapping the course of the Mekong River. Why did they do that? Not simply because they were born explorers, because they want to manage those places. To keep the British out, for starters, they wanted to own it themselves. And if you map it first, you kind of have a claim. And then anthropological studies. This is partly the answer to this. In the 60s, as we'll see next week, no, not next week, in 2 weeks' time, we have no class next week, right? It's exam week, so there's no class. In 2 weeks' time, I'm going to look into the question of ethics in anthropology, and the reflexive movement moves to a question of ethics because of Vietnam. There was an anthropological study by a man called George Condominus. He worked in the Highlands, Central Highlands, Jarai, I think. And his work was translated by the CIA and used to recruit Jarai to the anti-communist, anti-Viet Cong effort. They used anthropological studies against the people. And this caused ethical questions to be raised in America about by anthropologists saying, wait, why are we helping the war effort? Okay, take a 10-minute break. It's 13:36, so 13:46. After which we're going to talk about the midterm assessment. Okay. We're going on to a break, 5 minutes, and then there'll be part 2.